So today I wanted to revisit the Janissaries and what we've talked about before, and just sort of bring it all together into one cohesive thing. So just as a recap, the Janissaries were a class of ruling slaves who ruled during the Ottoman Empire. So even though they were slaves, they were the architects, the police, the administrators, the scholars, pretty much responsible for the running of the Ottoman Empire. And yet they were slaves. So the question really becomes, how did this make any sense? Because throughout the history of the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan, who was ostensibly in charge of all of this, could have chosen to give a position of power to a janissary, a son of a Christian slave who had gone through the process of becoming a janissary, or one of his own kind, a Turkish noble. And almost every time that that question came about, the Sultan would choose a janissary over a Turkish noble, which over time meant that the entire ruling class of the Ottoman Empire was comprised almost entirely of janissaries. And that really needs an explanation. Because if you think about it, the Sultan was essentially putting a foreign army in charge of his empire. I mean, would he have invited the Mongols to come in? And how quickly, if he had done that, how quickly would they have figured out that an even better deal would be to kill all of the Turkish nobles and the Sultan and redistribute the wealth of the Ottoman Empire to their kin instead of killing their kin? So obviously there's a rationale behind this choice that the Sultan made to have these janissaries in power versus his own people. This part of the series has really been about the rationale behind that choice. And again, it really needs an explanation. Now, the first thing I wanted to discuss before I get into the explanation, even deeper into the explanation of why he used janissaries over Turkish nobles to rule the Ottoman Empire, a Turkish empire, I'm going to just start by pointing something out. Our perception of slavery usually involves a lot of whips and chains and torture and blood. But the reality is that slavery was a lot more psychologically nuanced than the Hollywood impression would have you believe. Now, I mean, there were points in history where slavery very much was whips and chains, but those points of history usually didn't last long, and because they couldn't be maintained for very long. It was too obvious. So slavery was too obvious. And they really didn't characterize slavery on the whole, because there are many examples of empires in which slaves, well, they pretty much ran them. They were the skilled labor force. They were the doctors, the academics, the scholars. They were they were the accountants. They were the ones who knew how to read and write. You know, they ran empires. So slavery is a lot more subtle than whips and chains. It's a lot more psychologically nuanced. And when you understand that, you realize that there is a question here. Why did why did they run empires in which they were slaves? Why did they maintain the status quo when they were the ones who pretty much benefited least from it? And you can look at lots of empires and see the same thing. For example, the Roman Empire. Most of the skilled labor was slaves or freed slaves. And the Roman male citizens actually they were much more restricted in the types of jobs that they could take. They could be soldiers, farmers, or they could invest their wealth. And that was sort of it. They didn't have the same kind of options as the slave class. It's surprising, but true. Slaves could do more jobs. And in the Ottoman Empire, the same thing. The Janissaries were very, very well educated, very powerful slaves. So if you can imagine living in a world where your doctor's a slave, your policeman is a slave, hell, your mayor is a slave. Imagine living in that kind of world. That really needs an explanation. The real difference between a master and a slave isn't whips and chains. It's something a lot more subtle. The real difference between the master and the slave is that in every single society, even in those societies where slaves did many of the jobs that actually ran an empire, including running the empire, the masters, their positive identity was always innate to them. They were always born to the identities that they had, and they couldn't be taken away. Their identities were innate. They were passive aspects of their character. Whereas the slaves, their positive identity always derived by their utility to the societies that they were in. They had no other positive identity. And in fact, if you look at their behavior, they took their identities from their jobs. So they took their identities from being a policeman, from being the mayor, from being a doctor, from being an engineer. That's what they took their identities from. They had no sense of shared identity with other slaves. All of that was stripped from them. So they did not share an identity with the other slaves. In a very cosmopolitan Roman Empire, I mean, slaves came from everywhere. But in the Ottoman Empire, slaves actually came from very specific regions. Eventually, they came from very specific regions. So it's not necessarily that they didn't share nationalities at all. There were some slave populations that did. They shared religions and nationalities, even locales, but they still didn't derive their identities from these innate aspects of their person. They derived their positive identity from their utility within the cultures that they lived. They became their jobs, and that's all they were. And as soon as they had that they didn't have that utility, there was no worth to them. They had no value. And really, if you are a person living in a society that does not value you for anything but your utility to that society, odds are you're part of a slave class. Now I'm going to get back to the Janissaries and how the Sultan rebuilt a human mind into a tool of utility. Now, as I get into this a little bit deeper, the psychological parts of this a bit deeper, I'm just going to put out a few things. There are some complexities with the Ottoman Empire that, believe me, the rabbit hole goes deep in that one, but unfortunately we don't have time for all of that. So I'm going to keep it, there's more complexity here, but I'm going to keep it to just this. Why would the Sultan choose Janissaries over Turkish nobles or over a completely foreign army? And the answer lies in the psychological pressures that were brought to bear during the process of taking the son of Christian slaves and turning him into a janissary. And I'm going to go through step by step the psychological pressures that were applied and basically amount to an emotional hack, a way of hacking people's emotions to turn them into tools of utility. Now, in my installment on the Ottoman Empire, I explained how the Janissaries were the sons of Christian slaves, and they were taken from their families, and they were forced to march, usually several hundred miles. And after they were finished this forced march, they were converted to Islam, brainwashed, in other words. Here's what's really happening. I mean, it's horrible on a physical level, but on a psychological level is really where the magic happens. Very sarcastic use of the term magic. First off, we look at this kid, and they were kids. They were usually between the ages of 7 and 10. This kid is being taken from his family. But let's look at the parents' reaction. The parents are slaves. Most likely they reacted with simple resignation. Here, take our son. We don't have a choice. They probably didn't fight. They probably didn't put too much of a fuss. In fact, many of them were probably eager for their sons to have a chance to get out of poverty. So they might have even pushed him out the door and been happy about this. But here's the thing. What does that say to this 7 to 10-year-old boy? When you're 7 to 10, you still need your parents. On the level of the conscious mind, you can say something like, well, my parents are slaves. they can't stop me from being taken. And incidentally, this is what's really wonderful about slaves. You can take their children away and they'll just shuffle off into the dark and submit. They won't put up a fuss. So on the subconscious, that's a conscious level. That's a conscious level rationalization. My parents are slaves. They couldn't resist. But on a subconscious level, which is really where kids are operating most of the time, in fact, we all are operating most of the time, this is how it looks. My parents abandoned me. Now, it's not logical, it's not rational. A kid can feel all the pain of abandonment when his or her parents are killed. Absolutely no ability to stop it. His or her parents could not stop abandoning him or her because they're dead. But still, the kid feels it as an abandonment, and there will be anger and pain surrounding it, and humiliation in that sense of abandonment. And it's just going to be there. It's not going to be rational. It's not going to, it won't respond to a rational explanation. It'll just be this emotional ticking time bomb in the kid's emotional map. So, how is the kid going to deal with that? With the fact that his parents have abandoned him? They've either agreed to enthusiastically or just quietly submitted to him being stripped from them. Well, for one, he's probably going to be deeply emotionally invested in thinking that the Janissaries are wonderful people and the Sultan is a great guy. Because otherwise, he has to admit to himself that his parents abandoned him to an asshole. So right there, we see the beginning. We see the basis of the hack. And the hack gets more complex. Then the prospective janissary is marched 400 miles, no doubt watching other boys die of starvation, exhaustion, or exposure along the way. So now he's been abandoned. He's been forced to undergo a horrible experience, and believe me, he probably bonded with some of his compatriots on the way there. So he had to watch them die. And now, when he gets to his destination, he's going to be brainwashed into Islam, into revoking his Christian faith and adopting the Muslim faith. And what's interesting about faiths is faiths are sort of like systems of belonging. So now he's going to be revoking his Christian system of belonging and adopting a system of belonging based on Islam. So he is going to see Muslims as a source of his new sense of belonging. You give this kid high motivation to see the Sultan as benevolent, as a benevolent figure, because otherwise he has to face the fact that his parents abandoned him to an asshole. He's not going to be inclined to do that. And we will, as children, we will believe all sorts of lies to preserve our belief in our parents' love. And barring that, we will believe all sorts of lies to preserve our belief in our parents' hatred. Because what really hurts is our parents' indifference. Our parents' indifference is a source of shame and humiliation. Because there's nothing worse than a parent who just doesn't give a shit. Just doesn't care. Doesn't even care enough to hate you. Just doesn't care. So in order to preserve his belief in his parents' love, this prospective janissary has to believe that this whole process is for his benefit, and the Sultan's a great guy, and he's going to have plenty of wonderful opportunities when he becomes a janissary. Happy, happy, joy, joy. But here's the other thing. This original abandonment, this original abandonment scars the janissary, the prospective, this boy, with a sense of shame and humiliation, a sense of not being worthy. This abandonment means that he will never look to himself for belonging. He will always look outside himself for belonging. And he will have a great motivation to try to earn belonging. And what's also interesting about the scar of shame is that the people who are thus scarred prefer to get their belonging from an external system that a whole bunch of people buy into. Because getting it from other people, you don't trust other people anymore. You don't trust other people, first of all, because you've been abandoned and betrayed, but also because you no longer feel like you're lovable, like you are a lovable human being. So you would rather get a copper penny than a hug. And that's where these boys are at. They would rather get a tin-plated medal than their parents back at this point. All of these effects come out of this brand of shame, this induced abandonment. And that's really, like I said, that's what's great about slaves, is that you can strip them of their children and they just sort of accept it. They don't fight. And their children see this, and it's extremely painful. This is more painful. I mean, it's not as dramatic as strapping someone down and shoving an iron onto their flesh, but it really is worse. It's fundamentally worse. These kids would have been taught to take their sense of belonging from Islam. In other words, they would have seen native Muslims as having something that they didn't have. And now, even if these converts were treated better than native Muslims, or were felt to be better Muslims, it doesn't matter, because this is a private wound, a private shame, and it would have resulted in different pressures on these two groups of Muslims. These converted Muslims who feel like they'll never belong, in part because they really don't, and also because they were abandoned by their parents. And these native Muslims who never were put through this kind of torture, emotional torture, and feel, that they're just naturally what they are. They just, their value is natural. It's their value is inborn. It's innate. So that's going to create a different approach to life, so we shall say. Now, these boys, these Janissaries, were taught to take their sense of belonging from Muslims, from Islam. At the same time as they still do have this really powerful sense of powerlessness associated with the Sultan and the Janissary Corps. And it's that powerlessness, that sense of humiliation, that really drives pride-seeking behavior. Pride being sort of a scar that's left after humiliation has done its work. And it also drives a desire for dominance. You can dominance through competition, but in particular, and here's the real sweet spot of slavery. This is what all of this emotional hacking is leading up to. A master wants a slave that dominates her through serving her benefit. And to explain this, you can dominate someone two different ways. First is the obvious way, you can destroy them. The second is that you can serve their needs, you can serve their vulnerabilities. You're still establishing yourself as dominant, but you're establishing yourself as dominant without violating that sense of belonging to your master. So you are, in fact, dominating your master and getting a relief from that sense of powerlessness that your master put into you in the first place. But anyway, but are you dominating them in such a way as benefiting them at the same time? So you are relieving that sense of powerlessness as you are earning your sense of belonging. This is the slavery sweet spot. This is what you have to hit to get the kind of slave you can rely on to run your society. A slave that sees you, the master, as the source of his belonging, and also wants to dominate you in order to relieve his sense of powerlessness. If you get those two in just the right proportion, you end up with a slave who is endlessly compelled to serve your vulnerabilities. He wants to dominate you, but he also wants to belong to you. So what does he do? Help! Help! Dun dun dun! He's going to be your hero. And that is the slavery sweet spot. That is how you create a slave class that you can trust with all the power of society, and know that those slaves, all they're ever going to use their power for is to help you, is to serve your vulnerabilities as the master class. So This is essentially the end result of the Sultan's emotional hack of the Janissary. The end result is creating a slave who sees the Sultan as the source of his belonging, at the same time is powerfully motivated through that sense of powerlessness to dominate the Sultan. What happens? You get a hero. You get someone who is compelled constantly to be your hero. Now, this process can go south in a very, very bad way. And what happens when it goes south is when that sense of belonging and that sense of desire to dominate isn't in the right proportion. Now, if your slave has a great desire to belong to you as the master class, but no real desire to dominate you, you just end up with a slave who's perfectly happy staring adoringly at you for the rest of your life. You know, annoying, useless, but not really deadly problem. And you probably, as a master class, you probably do want a few slaves that spend all of their time writing sonnets about how beautiful you are and painting your portrait and fucking you just exactly the way you want. But ultimately, as the master class, you do want a slave who does work. So again, that sense, imbuing the slave with that sense of powerlessness and that sense of desiring to belong to you, creating that balance to create a slave who wants to be your hero is really where it's at. Otherwise, you're not gonna. You need to create that balance so that you create a slave that is constantly motivated to do shit, as opposed to just nothing. But the thing is that sometimes you get it wrong. You get that balance wrong, and it goes really south. And what happens is that you end up with a slave whose desire to dominate is significantly greater than his desire to belong. And yeah, that can be a pain, because you end up with a slave who is very aggressive, um, doesn't really care about you, um, wants to destroy you, or dominate you, just period. And that's sort of a dangerous slave, and it happens. Let's face it, it happens. Sometimes you put too much pressure one way, not enough pressure another, and you get a monster. Let's face it, you get a sociopath. But ultimately, what's interesting is that even these slaves are sort of limited in their understanding of the entire system. Because, for example, throughout history, the history of the Ottoman Empire, there have been occasions where Janissaries have overthrown sultans, which is terrible. But what did the Janissaries do? They installed another sultan, which is sort of like declaring war on the electric company by changing a light bulb. It's despite the fact that they were in a position to destroy the system, they just continued to support it. And that's really the point. Even the bad slaves are still slaves. Because they could have, if they had been not thinking like slaves, they could have said, you know what, we don't need another sultan. What we need is to completely dismantle this empire, take the riches, and give them to our own people. But no, they just installed a different sultan. So even the bad slaves are still slaves. And yeah. So that's sort of the slavery sweet spot. And that's how you get a slave that you can rely upon to rule your empire. You create a slave that sees you as a source of his belonging and wants to dominate you because you've instilled a sense of powerlessness in him. So you get a slave who's sort of like, my holy calling in life is to serve my master's benefit and thereby become dominant over her. And that's sort of his thing. And that's the slavery sweet spot. You hit that spot just right, and you keep hitting it generation after generation after generation, and you create a system of slavery that will perpetuate infinitely, infinitely down the generations. Hit it just right. When you hit the slavery sweet spot just right, you create a person who is defined by his utility, solely defined by his utility to a society. So to bring this back to the question I asked in the beginning, why did the Sultan choose Janissaries over Turkish nobles when he had to appoint someone to a position of power? Well, the answer is really simple. It's because the Janissaries would take their positive identity from their job. And in doing so, they would be far more inclined to do a good job and avoid partisan politicking than the Turkish nobles. So the Janissaries sort of ended up ruling the Ottoman Empire the way traffic light rules an intersection. It really doesn't rule at all. It just oversees it. And that's why they were chosen. Slaves sort of, and you can see this over and over in these different cultures, slaves sort of form a buffer class of people who simply do their job of running the society. They don't engage in the power politics because they can't, because they have that one layer of remove. They do not have the ability to form a cohesive identity with other slaves. So that limits their ability to create partisan politics. And they are very focused on earning their value as opposed to playing games. So you end up with these groups of slaves that do the tasks that sort of buffer the people who are interested in playing partisan politics. And in the process, in that buffering, the slave classes actually create stability within the empires in which they find their belonging, their sense of belonging, by serving.